Hello. Hello, everyone. And again, thank you for joining us today. I'm Julia Novakovic. I've been the archivist here at the Strong National Museum of Play in Rochester since 2013.
And I'm Beth Merkle, Director of the Library and Archives at the Strong, where I've been since 2014. Today's presentation is the culmination of 2 Regional Library Council funded grant projects, as well as our experiences dealing with electronic media formats and born digital files.
Today, we're going to talk about our projects to image floppy disks and digitize U-matic tapes and how these fit into our overall digital preservation strategy here at the Strong. We'll also cover various preservation tactics, accessioning digital collections, as well as helpful tools and resources.
A little background about our institution. The Strong houses the world's most comprehensive collection of toys, dolls, board games, video games, electronic games, books, and other historical materials related to play. Our mission is to explore play and the ways in which it encourages learning, creativity, and discovery, and illuminates cultural history. The Strong is home to the National Toy Halls of Fame, the World Video Game Hall of Fame, the American Journal of Play, the International Center for the History of Electronic Games, and the Brian Sutton Smith Library and Archives of Play.
So that keeps us pretty busy. In June, I presented a DIPSNY webinar about identifying endangered media formats within your collections. At the Strong, we reached kind of a tipping point when it came to obsolete formats with the acquisition of our Atari coin-op division corporate records. Within the 700 linear feet of materials in this collection, we received game design documentation, corporate records, artwork, schematics, technical drawings, photographs, and pretty much every media format that existed between 1971 and 2003. This collection had more than 1,000 floppy disks of all sizes, about 2,300 magnetic tapes, including VHS, Beta, and U-matic. And as we received requests to view these formats, which we at the time did not have the ability to access, we realized that a lot of these historical media formats, just like discs and CDs and DVDs that were just used 20 or even 10 years ago, are already considered obsolete or are in grave danger. So we basically had to come up with a plan to address preservation of our endangered media formats. Step 1 was identify the formats present in the collection and assess their risk levels. Step 2 would be to create disk images of digital media contents and extract their metadata, along with AV format migration. And after that, we would then move on to step 3, properly house and store the original media with corrosion inhibiting sleeves and in colder storage than they were presently in. And finally, step 4, access the content from the disk images using emulators and other software tools, as well as our migrated AV formats. And after hitting each of these milestones, we figured we would be well on the way to good long-term digital preservation. We took a deep dive into step 1, identifying the formats present in the collection and assessing the risk levels. We did a preservation survey, we listed out the formats in the archives, and we researched their life expectancies, along with the best practices for data migration and digitization. We determined that the media in the archives that was currently at the highest risk with the largest quantities were our floppy disks and our U-matic tapes.
There are grant opportunities all around us, but very few grant opportunities that match our exact needs, as we all know. At the time, digitization grants from our state archives still focused, I'm not kidding, on microfilming your print collections. CLIR, the Council on Library and Information Resources, offers recordings at risk grants, which would cover the outsourced cost of digitizing magnetic media, such as U-matic tapes. But the minimum award amount would mean sending all the U-matic tapes in our collection out to be digitized, no matter their significance, and then needing to fund their storage, backup, and conversion for the rest of time immortal. In 2015-2016, our Regional Library Council, RRLC, or the Rochester Regional Library Council, revamped its RBDB grant program. RBDB stands for Regional Bibliographic Databases and begun as a stream of funding from the State Department of Education to libraries for retrospective conversion, getting libraries from card catalogs to online patron access catalogs, or OPACs. Since things have changed just a little bit in the past few decades, RRLC was looking to use this funding for the projects they're area libraries wanted and needed, focusing on innovative programs and projects involving new and emerging technologies and digitization. The library team at The Strong works closely with RRLC on many projects, so we were comfortable approaching them with our proposal for a pilot project focused on imaging floppy disks.
So a quick refresher for everyone, a 5¼ inch floppy disk consists of a polyester circle or cookie that's coated with iron oxide particles, and those are magnetized into the ones and zeros that make up the bits of data. The cookie is housed inside a flexible plastic sleeve that's sealed at the outside edges, and there's a hole in the center that exposes a small amount of that cookie. There's a small oval window that shows the cookie too. Between the cookie and plastic disc sleeve is sometimes a polyester felt ring at the center to help the cookie move and prevent scratching. And when a 5¼ floppy disk fails, the magnetic media can shed from that polyester support. And this magnetic media shed is a characteristic of floppy disks. The disks can also be sensitive to magnetic fields, and even a disk drive in imperfect condition can cause physical damage to the disk itself. 3½ inch floppy disks are similar, just a little smaller, and encased in a plastic container without constant exposure of the cookie inside. There are also, of course, 8-inch floppy disks, which they used before 5¼ inch disks. So digitization use might be considered a possible but risky final use for both 5¼ and 3½ inch disks. In the summer of 2017, our research library applied for and received a technology grant from RRLC. Our project plan stated, "The Strong seeks to demystify the daunting aspects of digitization by establishing an efficient, scalable, and cost-effective model for identifying and assessing endangered media at the point of acquisition, converting and preserving the content to ensure future access." So we developed a pilot project to read a sampling of disks across several different archival collections. Our goal was to test 100 floppy disks out of all of the 3½ inch and 5¼ inch floppy disks identified as endangered media. By performing this task, we hope to have a diversity of material digitized with varying condition issues to give a better representation of what percentage of a supposedly already obsolete media collection could potentially still be viable. It would also give us a sampling of what to expect on other unlabeled disks in collections as we move beyond this pilot project with the mindset to digitize more of our endangered media in the archives. And when we talk about imaging floppy disks, that means creating a sector by sector copy of the source medium, replicating the structure and contents of the storage device. It doesn't necessarily mean that we can immediately open up a file and view it. This only shows us that data is contained on sectors of the disk and should be viable once we identify the proper software to open the file. This might be original software itself or emulators, which enable a computer program to act like another. So we performed the following steps. We researched and purchased conversion lab equipment with the help of our IT staff. We installed necessary hardware and software and ran tests on our equipment. We established and documented workflow and procedures, including what we would do for metadata collection and as well as our reporting standards. And we recruited and hired a digital conversion technician. So while writing the grant, we came up with a list of about 20 pieces of hardware or software that we need to work on the floppy disk conversion. Most important of all were 2 CryoFlux controllers. Along with that came licenses, cables, drives, disk drive components, memory, a dedicated standalone PC that we wouldn't have connected to our network, and also storage within our digital asset management system. So while it might be unlikely that any computer virus would be found on the floppy disks that would eventually impact our network, especially while making preservation copies, we wanted to isolate the imaging computer to remove any risk of damaging other computer systems on the network. And the total cost of hardware for this project was about $5,800, $5,000 of which was licensed CryoFlux hardware and software. So a CryoFlux, it sounds very magical. It's a very fancy name. The CryoFlux, it's a device side driver that allows a floppy disk and an old disk drive to communicate with our modern day computers. And this was vital to our project. While acquiring and setting up our floppy disk digitization station, I dealt with the determination of what 100 disks we would use for our pilot project. In my previous presentation, I addressed our values for criteria for digitization with our acronym RAVE. Those stand for rare, at risk, valuable, and engaging. I pre-selected our 100 sample disks based off of the item level metadata created during the preservation survey. I chose 60 discs from the Atari Coin-Op Division corporate records, since it was the largest portion of our collections, and 10 discs each from the Penguin Software, Broderbund Software, Tengen Inc., and Brian Fargo collections in the archives. Our digital games curator, Andrew Borman, helped me to determine the workflow and procedures for imaging the discs. By adapting the instructions found in the CryoFlux manual, along with our equipment, and through the process of using non-archival floppy disks to test the equipment, we refine our workflow to take into consideration as many possible factors that would impact the imaging process as possible, from variations in the floppy drives themselves to making sure cables are plugged in the proper way every time. And after getting all of the hardware and software set up, we developed a guide to the care and handling of floppy disks. We developed our project process document, and we refined our metadata spreadsheet. And our digitization technician started conversion work in February 2018. So we trained Lauren Phillips, who was our digitization technician, on the use of equipment and software, the process and standards for metadata creation, and the care and handling of endangered media. After training, she began the conversion and metadata creation from our 100 selected disks. So here's the thing. At the beginning, we honestly had no idea how long this project would take. We didn't have an initial metric for how long a CryoFlux needs to open and image a floppy disk. Would it be several minutes? Would it be 20 minutes? It was really a guessing game for us from the start. We just didn't know enough about the condition of the disks either to know for sure. 100 disks sounded like a good sample size to start with. And once we had the CryoFlux running in the previous stage of the project, we realized maybe 100 disks might go more quickly than originally anticipated. With that, we thought, great, once Lauren's done imaging the disks, she can move on to seeing if we can read the stream data for each disk. So there's a lot more trial and error involved with that to figure out what programs we need, what file formats can be migrated to newer readable format, things like that. So within her first week, 20 hours, Lauren had imaged all 100 disks selected for our pilot project. And out of the 100 disks, only one could not be imaged. So to us, that was great. That was a whopping 99% success rate. And the average length of time it took per disk to be imaged was just under 3.5 minutes. So we were basically astonished. It is really important, though, to note that our success rate really means that a successful stream using the CryoFlux happened. It didn't necessarily mean that the data is completely intact like it was back when it was originally created. Instead, it basically means we're able to read the magnetic flux from the floppy disk that still remains on the disk as of the time that it was imaged. So there still could possibly be bad sectors or unseen corruption on the files that wouldn't necessarily be evident until we took a deeper dive. Based on a combination of the metadata that was written on the disks themselves, as well as information we know based on the source of the disks and the time period that the disks were created, we were then able to convert the preservation streams into a variety of other disk formats that could be accessed using other tools. So Lauren moved on to this, indicating the disk type, a brief description of the files on the disk, if there were any bad sectors that couldn't be read properly. And despite successful streams, some sectors could be damaged in some way, which might prevent some of the data from being successfully read. We used the Disk Tool Console, or DTC software, that was included with the CryoFlux to convert from the preservation streams to more easily read our disk images. So there are other tools that exist to analyze the streams, and many are designed for specific formats, such as the Atari 8-bit computer format, and don't necessarily offer the flexibility of the DTC tool. So based on the format of the disks, various tools can be used to open and view their contents. For instance, WinImage is a great tool to view floppy disk images that were created for MS-DOS-based systems once they've been converted. The contents could be extracted from there or loaded directly onto the PC emulator DOSBox to be analyzed further. So DOSBox takes that old computer hardware from the 1980s to early 1990s, and it makes it into a piece of software. So when you run something like an old game in DOSBox, the game thinks that it's running on an older computer, and it has no idea that it's actually running on something that's thousands of times faster. So DOSBox is free. It's available on nearly every device today, from Windows and Mac computers, even your cell phone. And it's really a convenient way of testing old software without needing tons of original hardware. There were some limitations to the hardware that we selected, though. Apple II disk drives and disks are unique, which allow developers to create floppy disks that are really unlike anything else out there, particularly when it comes to copyright protection that would prevent us from running copies. Because of this, whatever Apple II images were created likely aren't our perfect preservation copies. But there's a new tool out there called the applesauce floppy disk drive controller that seems to solve that issue. If you look at the image of a PC floppy disk on the left side of the screen, you can see that the sectors on the disk are all aligned in like a very neat and orderly manner. The CryoFlux has no problem with these disks, but compare that to the picture of the disk image from the game Joust on the Apple II on the right side of the screen. You can really just see how different an Apple II disk can be. There's really just a whole entire section of the disks that appears to have nothing on it. That's just how the Apple II wrote to disks. And to add to the challenge, this layout can be different between different pieces of Apple II software. So again, a more specialized tool like the applesauce floppy drive controller would be recommended for that. Some platforms also used flippy floppy disks. So these are disks that could be written to on both sides. It was common on the Commodore 64. And these floppy disks require a flippy modified driver to make the best copies of the disks. And we did not have that at the time of this project. So we kind of ran into some issues with that. After the 100 disk pilot project portion was completed, we wisely decided to use Lauren's expertise and time to continue working on producing disk images of additional floppy disks in the archives collections. We also continued to select certain disks for reading the imaged files to access digital files that had been stuck on these disks for 20 to 30 years or more. So you can see here that the number of disks imaged per collection. Our original pilot project had 100. And then on top of that, we added 966 from Atari, 196 from Jordan Mechner, Penguin Software had 180, and Tengen had 126. And then you see a bunch that in here that are sprinkled in, dozens or even single digits. But really the grand total of the image disks was 1,756. So our project morphed slightly once we discovered that the time per disk was around 3.5 minutes and that we had such a high success rate with imaging the pilot project's disks. Again, a 99% success rate. If we hadn't had this grant funding, we would have had to default to our rave values for determining which disks should be imaged next. So instead, we systematically went through our archival collections and had Lauren work on imaging all of the disks in a collection so that we had the data and we could later work on reading the disk images. With floppy disks, the file size was so minimal that this was possible. We wouldn't be able to use the same mindset for larger media formats like video or audio files. In total, it was about 92 gigabytes of data from more than 1,750 floppy disks. We maintain spreadsheets for the metadata for each collection for ease of use, and we've migrated these disk images into Preservica, the digital asset management system for the museum. More on Preservica in a bit. I just wanted to show off some of these examples that we found on some of these floppy disks in the collection. So from the Brian Fargo papers, there's a game called The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. This was an unreleased PC game that was based on a 1966 sci-fi book of the same name. Very little was known about the game. There were just a few sentences in old magazines indicating that it had even ever existed. But with this floppy disk project, we were able to save not only a playable version of the game, but also the source code for it, both of which are likely the only copies in the world. From the Christy Marks papers, we had some game graphics from the game Conquest of Camelot for Sierra Online, as well as the TV show Bible for Gem. So for those of you who were not elementary school aged girls in the 1980s, Gem was a hit animated TV show and toy line about Jerrica Benton, who turns into the rock singer Gem with the help of a holographic computer. It was truly outrageous. So Christy Marks created this series, and within her floppy disks, we uncovered this Bible that the TV show writers would use for the series, as well as character backgrounds and storylines. It was one of my favorite things I've ever uncovered. And from the Atari Coin-Op-Division records, here's an example of a CAD drawing of Marble Madness 2 Marble Man. So these computer drawings show the size and dimension of the physical arcade cabinet for Marble Man. Kind of like The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, this game was canceled before it hit the market. So while there might be one or two cabinets in the hands of collectors or people who used to work at Atari, these drawings really give us an incredible look at the design process for this game. So working with the image disk files and the metadata that we captured during the project, we analyzed and reported our conversion statistics and data. So for this objective, we examined outputs from disk conversion and reported our findings. Again, we were really pleasantly surprised at the high success rate and the ability to open digital files that were 20 to 40 years old. For example, our Christy Marks papers, they contain more than 80 floppy disks. There was only about 1 linear foot of physical paper materials in that collection. But by reading through the contents of the floppy disks that we imaged during the project, we were able to uncover character reference details, television scripts, project outlines, computer graphics, game design documentation, and much more to flesh out the content and context of Marx's collection here at The Strong. We also continued to read contents of disk images as time permitted within our collections. And we plan for upcoming information sessions for the general public and, even library professionals, obviously, detailing our process findings and recommendations. As many of you know, you'll often see this kind of phase with grant-funded projects. So our outreach activities included presenting at the fall 2018 NILA conference to a group of RRLC members in January 2019. We also presented at the summer 2019 NIAC conference and also to the Western New York Library Resource Council in fall 2019.
We hoped that our pilot project with floppy disks would be scalable and allow us to digitize incoming acquisitions of archival collections, which contain 5¼ and 3½ inch floppy disks fitting our RAIV values. We anticipated that the model created through that grant could be adapted with different equipment to the digitization and preservation of other endangered magnetic media, such as U-matic tapes that we have in the Strong's archival collections. U-matic tapes are a magnetic media supported by polyester. Unlike most other cassette-based tape formats, the reel turns in opposite directions. The cassette is inserted into the player, the door opens, and tape is pulled out to a hub that is free to spin, traveling in a U shape into the player. A metal video drum continuously spins against the moving tape. When U-matic tapes have already deteriorated to the point of magnetic media shed, the sticky shed will stick to the spinning video drum. Sticky shed is caused by hydrolysis of the binder in the tape. The shed will redeposit on the tape that follows until the tape play is stopped. When digitizing U-matic tapes, this means that not only is the U-matic tape with sticky shed damaged, but the U-matic player must be opened and cleaned on a regular basis to maintain a clean video drum and tape heads. Sounds like fun. Again, digitization may be considered a final use that poses its own set of risks to the original copy. This is another instance where once we get a tape in the player, we might want to just digitize it then because it may never play again, and this would be considered the final use of the physical object. In the summer of 2018, we submitted another application to the RRLC Technology Grants Program using our successful floppy disk pilot project as a model for our U-matic materials. Our project goal was the same, seeking to demystify the daunting aspects of audiovisual digitization by establishing an efficient, scalable, and cost-effective model for the region that identifies and assesses endangered media at the point of acquisition and converts and preserves the content to ensure future access. Before submitting the grant application, Julia and our Director of Conservation identified 730 U-matic tapes within the archives, which would require immediate attention. There are 770 U-matic tapes in total within the collection. 40 were selected for digitization by an outside vendor in 2016. Nearly all of these tapes are housed within the Atari Coin-Up Division corporate records. Based on the content of the other represented materials and labeled metadata, these tapes likely contain arcade game commercials, game demonstrations, company event footage, information for arcade operators, and more. The bulk of the U-matic tapes in the Atari Coin-Up Division corporate records are undated, though labeled tapes indicate a date range between 1981 and 1989. We also identified U-matic tapes in an unprocessed collection that were selected due to their usefulness to our staff in planning exhibits. In the Ken Fidesna papers were more than 200 magnetic tapes, including U-matic, from Fidesna's time at Midway and Williams Games. Given the uncertainties inherent in our U-matic collection, are the labels of the contents accurate, if there is a label? How many minutes of actual recording are on each tape? Is this just a recording of an episode of Magnum PI? We couldn't set a goal for digitizing 10, 20, or 100 tapes with any concept of whether this would be an achievable goal. So our U-matic pilot project goal became 2,000 minutes of raw footage. As we did in our floppy disk project, we began our U-matic project by researching and purchasing conversion lab equipment, installing necessary hardware and software and running tests on the equipment, establishing and documenting workflow and procedures, including metadata collection and reporting standards, recruiting and hiring a digital conversion technician to begin work in February 2019. In January 2019, we identified and purchased the necessary equipment for the conversion lab. We assembled all the equipment in a side room within the museum's conservation lab. Equipment included a U-matic player, CRT monitor, audio monitor, waveform vector scope monitor, cables, an external time-based corrector, an analog digital converter, an AV rack, a hard drive, and various software. We went with open source free software such as Open Broadcaster Studio, OBS, Audacity, and Virtual Dub. We based our conversion lab on the American Institute for Conservation's Electronic Media Group best practices for tape digitization. These best practices are established by many EMG member institutions such as XFR Collective and Recovering Analog Digital Data, which is RAD. However, our final purchase list varied depending on what equipment we had on hand and the condition of the equipment we purchased. The refurbishing of the U-matic player came in at a lower price than expected, so we used the remaining funds to refurbish 2 beta players with an eye to building capacity for digitizing magnetic media and other formats. Our total expenses for hardware and software were $7,227. In the second quarter of our project, we welcomed back Lauren Phillips, our digitization technician from the previous project. We knew from working with her on the floppy disk project that she would be thorough, keep accurate metadata, document workflow, and work independently. Lauren began work in February that year and was trained by Julia Hillary Ellis, who was our previous director of conservation, and Rich Olson, our refurbished U-matic vendor, on the use of equipment and software, the process and standards for metadata creation, the care and handling of magnetic tape, and common issues and solutions for the equipment. This was significantly more intensive than dealing with the floppy disk drives and CryoFlux. So at least once a day, Lauren would have to disassemble the U-matic machine and carefully clean the head drums, rollers, and any surface of the machine's interior which the tape would touch. This would ensure that any particle flecks which had come off the magnetic tapes due to sticky shed or natural wear and tear would not build up on the drum or rollers and cause damage to subsequent tapes. So cleaning was done with chamois sticks or cotton swabs dipped into isopropyl alcohol. With a side-to-side motion, never up and down, she would use the chamois stick on the drum head, holding the stick against the drum head and manually spinning the drum slowly while applying light pressure. This would clean the drum head of any dust, dirt, or potential sticky shed particles. With a cotton swab dipped lightly in isopropyl alcohol, she would then clean pinch rollers and rollers near the drum, being very careful to avoid any rubber objects. Alcohol will cause rubber to crack and dry, and we learned that with machines this old and hard to come by, it is necessary to maintain every part for as long as possible. With the cleaning process perfected, Lauren began the conversion and metadata creation of the 2,000 minutes of raw footage held on U-matic tapes, comprised of tapes from the Atari Coin-Up Division corporate records and the Ken Fidesna papers. The third and fourth quarters were dedicated to analyzing and evaluating the data and output from the project, then reporting out to our community of librarians and archivists on our findings. Over the course of 4 months, our technicians successfully digitized about 1,920 minutes or 32 hours of video from our U-matic tapes, learning to live by the phrase coined by our local U-matic expert, Rich Olson, which is, "It's always the tapes." So Lauren came across a few tapes that during an attempt to rewind, the tape would come up with a error-02 message. This message means excessive tape slack, but really could mean any general error for the machine. Without the ability to rewind our tapes, we were unable to digitize our media. It turns out that our U-matic player was not the issue. Lauren discovered that the Ampex brand of tapes are notorious for not playing and causing this error. Ampex made both 60 and 20-minute stock of this tape, and we had both in the archival collection. So the 60-minute tapes were absolutely causing errors. So Lauren tested some of the 20-minute Ampex tapes from our collection, but did not get any error-02 messages. So we now know to avoid 60-minute Ampex stock for our digitization. It's always the tapes. The team again presented at the New York Archives Conference in June and at the Western New York Library Resource Council in September 2019. On the tapes we digitized, we found all sorts of documentation that had rarely been viewed outside the confines of these companies' offices. Along with promotional videos and commercials, we discovered focus group testing, manufacturing and assembly footage, news segments on the popularity and dangers of arcade games and pinball, and gameplay recordings. One tape of note included the soup to nuts of development for the World Video Game Hall of Fame inductee Mortal Kombat. It had concept art, stop motion animation, sound design, original recordings of actors performing the characters' moves, which would then be digitized and animated for the game. Another tape contained promotional footage for Tengen arcade games for home consoles, such as the Nintendo Entertainment System, featuring popular games like RBI Baseball, Gauntlet, and Pac-Man. There was candid footage of employees from within the Atari offices and recordings of Atari staff retreats and conferences. There was also a 1983 television pilot for a show called The Video Game Challenge, hosted by Bobby Sherman, featuring world champion game players Ben Gold and Eric Ginner.
So as I mentioned earlier, the museum uses Preservica as our digital asset management system. We ended up selecting Preservica after considering several options because it really does everything we needed it to, from ingest with metadata to separating file storage into Glacier and S3 to also having a public access module. Get ready for a lot of acronyms on this slide. So Preservica uses the Open Archival Information System Model, OAIS, which has been adopted as a best practice in preserving digital information. It necessitates the creation of SIPs, submission information packages, APEs, archival information packages, and DIPs, dissemination information packages. Preservica fulfills the OAIS model and contains all the functions required to deliver advanced digital preservation. When an institution is able to achieve geographical redundancy, so that's locks, lots of copies keep stuff safe, and perform file fixity checks through a system like Preservica, then the repository may be considered a trusted digital repository, or a TDR. So we did have our digitization technician ingest the files from the floppy disk project, which were very minimal file sizes, and later the U-matic files, which were very large file sizes. Upload time into Preservica with our museum network speed was about 5 minutes per 1 gigabyte of data. And about a year into working with Preservica, the company changed the way that files were to be ingested. They switched from their SIP Creator desktop application to instead their web-based put tool. In 2020, we implemented a way to use Cloudberry MSP360, a cloud file management and synchronization utility, to help copy large files into our holding area for ingest. That was a step that had previously eaten up a ton of time. And as we found out the hard way, it made it impossible to ingest files larger than 5 gigabyte. So being able to use Cloudberry was a huge boon. With the help of a software engineer who happens to live at my house and be married to me, I wrote some command line scripts to ingest files directly into our Amazon buckets. It involved some trial and error, and we began to ingest hundreds of gigabytes at a time successfully. The other great feature is our ability to share some of our digitization projects online through their public access module, Universal Access. But we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes.
As a result of developing the grant project for U-matic tape digitization, we were able to get 2 operational U-matic players, which was a huge hurdle. We are still working to acquire additional hardware and players for media such as Betacam SP, VHS-C, High 8, data tape drives, and many others. As we forge ahead, we will also continue to analyze unique materials that fit our institutional guidelines for digitization, those that are rare, at risk, valuable, and engaging. Internally, we will need to discuss our institutional priorities regarding digitization on demand versus a steady workflow of ingesting AV and digital materials. By the way, it's necessary to keep information technology staff and the people in charge of budgets in the loop, because you don't want to spend 6 months digitizing materials in your collection if you don't have the means to store the data properly. Currently, our on-site capabilities include a standard size paper and photos scanner, which covers anything up to 11 by 17. It's a flatbed scanner, and it's a PlusTech OptiBook A300. Oversized paper and other thin media such as acetate with up to 36 inches wide and unlimited length can be scanned on our WideTech 36 oversized scanner. Bound volumes or up to 23 by 33 can be scanned on our overhead Bookeye V1A professional scanner. Film negatives, image transparencies can be digitized on the ImageBox MF 4-in-1 converter. And audio cassettes can be digitized. We have a Pile dual stereo cassette tape deck with MP3 converter and Audacity, which is an open source audio editing software. We can also do digital capture of analog U-matic, beta, and VHS videotapes in the archives. So we have players, converters, and open broadcaster software. And of course, we can do 3.5 and 5.25 inch floppy disks with CryoFlex device side driver and emulation tools. We also have original disk drives for CD-ROM and DVD-ROM ripping. This equipment has allowed us to digitize fragile and awkward material for online exhibits and for researchers, particularly during the travel restrictions of 2020. Many people stuck at home finally got around to refurbishing that pinball or arcade game sitting in their garage, and we were able to digitize and share large schematics and cabinet art using our WideTech and Bookeye scanners in particular. The museum is also in the midst of an expansion, and our WideTech scanner allowed us to digitize museum blueprints and schematics related to the expansion or previous work that had been done, and share them internally with the facilities team, buildings and grounds. Also, IT needs these blueprints to see where wiring might be or where things can be rewired. And we also were able to share them with the architects and contractors externally.
Our experiences with both the floppy disk and U-matic tape pilot projects have impacted our work in the archives and even the museum's artifact collections. We've discovered that we've changed our thinking when incoming acquisitions arrive at the museum. For example, instead of just boxing up AV formats altogether until they come up in the processing queue, I take a closer look at them to separate out different formats, review tape labels for compelling content, and figure out if any of the materials require immediate assistance. We've also realized that the more descriptive metadata we can capture up front, the better. Rather than just marking down a quantity or an object label, I also know it's important to mark down the size, manufacturer, tape or disk stock, and additional box or label information onto a spreadsheet so that we have the information on hand and don't need to handle the physical object too frequently. With digitization of the endangered media, this has allowed us to move away from the reliance on a physical object once the data has already been captured. Again, we've learned that endangered media formats aren't all that scary. For example, the floppy disk project with just $5,800 in hardware, plus a part-time digital conversion technician and some extra current research by the staff. The fact that we could get through more than 1,750 disks in a few months, it was really incredible. We needed the equipment, we needed the time for someone with experience to handle this. It actually didn't take too long. It wasn't all that expensive when it compared to what it might have cost to send out to a vendor. And now we know how to do this ourselves. And our experience with these projects also prompted collections team staff at the museum to write our digital preservation handbook.
So in 2019 and into 2020, a select group from our digital preservation working group collaborated to assemble our digital preservation handbook. With the collection of video games and related archival materials continuing to grow at the Strong, museum must adapt to collect, display, and preserve video game media and digital assets with the same expertise and confidence as we do with physical toys, games, art, housewares, and ephemera related to play. We thought it would be vitally important to help staff members, museum leadership, and interested outside parties understand the unique challenges of digital preservation. Our digital preservation handbook provides strategies, digitization methodology, and decision-making processes involved in digital preservation. We include details about measuring our institutional progress, workflows, our digital asset management plan, information about digital preservation in the library, archives, general museum collection, arcade games, and electronics games. We also identified challenges in each aspect of digitization and preservation work for these areas, spelling out that staff time, lack of equipment access, and limited data storage are three current limitations which we should strive to improve.
When preserving born digital materials, it may be necessary to stabilize file formats and migrate files to the most up-to-date version that's computer readable. So as a rule, platform independent, non-proprietary, well-supported open formats are preserved. Encrypted or password protected files are difficult to fully preserve, as are files with unembedded proprietary fonts. So our preferred file formats for common born digital materials are PDF or TXT for text, TIFF or JP2 for preservation, or JPEGs for access of raster images. For audio, AIFF or WAVs for preservation, and MP3 for access. For video, AVI or MOV for preservation, and MPEG or MP4 for access. With spreadsheets and databases, we love a CSV file, don't we, folks? As well as TXT are okay as well. And computer programs for preservation, we'd love to have the source code, and for access, the executable files. So when we're dealing with born digital materials from donors, we let donors know ahead of time that theoretically we can take on whatever files they're able to send us, again, with the caveat that we can't deal with proprietary formats or encrypted files. Preservica, our DAMs, is equipped to digitally preserve more than 1,200 different original file types. So stabilizing the formats for migration and access is still recommended for on-site use. Processing digital archival collections also requires arrangement and description, similar to what's needed for a physical collection. So it might be necessary to drill down to the item level to fully comprehend the contents and context of a digital collection, which is worth considering when you're estimating processing time and deadlines. We work with donors on file transfers across various platforms: Dropbox, Google Drive, WeTransfer, OneDrive, you name it. Sometimes we have some file size limitations to work around. For example, if you're trying to send me a terabyte of data, I would prefer to receive that on a physical external hard drive instead of doing some file transfers over the network. So it's really a case-by-case basis. And aside from standalone files, we also have the ability to accession copies of full personal websites, such as fan sites for specific games that are no longer being updated.
Due to the nature of our collections in the archives, a huge portion of which is from the late 20th century to present day, we don't have the copyright permissions to share full collections online, nor are many of our materials in the public domain. So before anyone can access material from our collection, they sign our use of collections material agreement form, which states that the researcher assumes all responsibility for conforming to copyright restrictions and only has permission to use the materials for private study, scholarship, or research. Beyond that, especially when it comes to publications or documentaries, they're required to contact the copyright holder. The Strong also has a digital game files access policy, which states that the museum can make digital game files within its holdings accessible to on-site researchers only in a read-only capacity, unless prior permission is received from the holder of the intellectual property rights for the researcher to receive a digital copy. So technically, providing on-site access to materials means that we have less hoops to jump through. We have 2 dedicated digital access workstations in the reading room. When a researcher requests access to a collection, we copy it from an access hard drive onto the desktop of the computer workstation. That way, we're not touching the preservation copy at all, which has been ingested into our digital asset management system. And researchers can peruse the copied collection at their leisure and without worries that anything can go wrong. Our technology corner is the section of the reading room where we keep our scanners, players, and other digitization equipment. It's simplest for us to have a researcher view a U-matic tape that's being output through a video capture card and open broadcaster software directly onto a computer. For long distance researchers, this can be a little trickier. Depending on the amount of requested by the researcher, which is technically at staff discretion, we may be able to provide files via transfer, again, your Dropbox, Google Drive, and WeTransfer, with a watermark added.
For digital collections or projects within the library and archives that we do have permission to share online, we've taken advantage of the universal access module of Preservica. So from the Preservica dashboard, we can change permissions for individual files at the folder level to public, making them accessible via our Preservica universal access side. Our universal access portal is WordPress based, so we can customize the look and feel of the portal with images and text. We can also change permissions as needed. So for example, if we had a digital collection up for Women's History Month, we could easily adjust the permissions from open to public and back again. So we can make temporary projects online. Currently, we have over 2,000 digitized trade catalogs from the library, digitized diaries of George S. Parker, the founder of Parker Brothers, and several oral history projects. So digitized audio from cassettes, as well as transcripts available for researcher access online. It's terrific. So if you attended our Identifying Endangered Media Formats presentation that I gave in June, some of this might look familiar. So here are some really helpful resources that we found for identifying your formats. So there's the Texas Commission on the Arts Videotape Identification and Assessment Guide, Jim Wheeler's Videotape Preservation Handbook. We have some things from NARA. We have FACET, the Field Audio Collection Evaluation Tool from Indiana University, Handling and Storage of Audio and Video Characters from the International Association of Sound and Audiovisual Archives, some information from the Government of Canada, and of course, one of my favorite sites out there, the Museum of Obsolete Media. So they have a really useful page for media by date of obsolescence, as well as their data media timeline.
So resources specifically relating to the creation of our digital preservation handbook and the selection of our digital asset management system. So from the NDSA, the levels of digital preservation, the tools grid, which is inspired by the original power grid, which is POWRR, which stands for the Preserving Digital Objects with Restricted Resources. That was the original project. From Theory to Action, Good Enough, Digital Preservation Solutions for Under-Resourced Cultural Heritage Institutions, which was a white paper from 2014. And Walk This Way, Detailed Steps for Transferring Born Digital Content from Media You Can Read In-House, which is by Ricky Irway and Juliana Barrera Gomez for OCLC. We're continually working with electronic media formats in the Brian Sutton Smith Library and Archives of Play at the Strong, and it's not going to slow down anytime soon. Again, even if this seemed a little intimidating, you don't have to solve this all in one day or 1 week or a month. Internally discussing your institution's goals and capabilities is a great place to start. And of course, other colleagues in the field are happy to help point you in the right direction.
Thank you for listening. We are here for your questions.
That's right.
So our first question in the chat box is, do you have a video recording of how to clean the U-matic player that could be shared if someone wanted to learn how?
That is a great question. We should take a video of it next time we clean it, and we will share it on our social media. Thank you for adding to my to-do list, Elizabeth.
Let's see. Can you please send the names and price of the various machines you have for digitization?
So yeah, I mean, we can point you to our vendor. That the thing is that some of these were acquired, you know, even 3-4 years ago. So unfortunately, especially with refurbished equipment, it's kind of hard to put a price on those, but we can definitely point you in the directions of somebody who might have that information. So if you just want to send us an email, and then Beth and I can pull that information together for you.
Yeah, and we can even the lists that we started from, identifying, it'll at least have like the name of what you're looking for, and whether, you know, sometimes the price, a lot of times you'll be looking on eBay for these, you know, cords with very strange names. But at least we had a list to go from, and, you know, prices change, and especially in the, you know, in 2020 and 2021, the prices have gone crazy for some things. But I can absolutely give you our the list that we started from when we were doing this.
Okay. So I'm going to give folks just another like minute or so to add in any other questions that they have. Beth and Julia, I definitely recommend checking out the chat box because there's a lot of praise for you both in here.
Oh,
so
thanks, guys. That makes it all worth it.
I have another question. How do you typically back up digital files once they've been created?
So we are backing stuff up on the network continually. And we also, once we ingest our digital files into Preservica, it's nice that we don't have to worry about those there. I also tend to keep an external hard drive, like a very fancy 4 terabyte external hard drive that I will copy digital collections onto as well, so that I have my own kind of backup. But yeah, we've done pretty well with all of that so far.
Yeah, and one of the things that that we are hoping to work with our IT department with, now that we have Preservica, is that, you know, there's a lot more saving and sort of redundant copies while we're in the midst of a project. Like the over 2,000 trade catalogs, that was a huge amount of data, right? And so we were, you know, having it in multiple places, multiple drives, and the director of IT was like, what are you doing to me and my backup capacity? So we've kind of worked with them to develop a workflow for, you know, while a project is happening, and we'll be changing, you know, we'll be updating, you know, adding more to this, you know, this digital collection, that there's much more backup continually. But then once the project is sort of done, then they can sort of back it up locally at a different schedule, and then we have our copies in Preservica. So we've just because there's so much going on in the museum, we've had to sort of create this workflow so that we're not, you don't open up your drive, you know, on your computer and see your team's collection in the red, because you've got so much data on there. So
next question, have you imaged any digital data tape formats, for example, DC2120 mini cartridges, or done any research on those formats?
The short answer is yes, we've done some research on those formats. The problem is there are so many different data tape drives out there. And So it's a matter of acquiring those pieces of equipment. Luckily, this year we've been working to build our capacity of our digital preservation lab for the whole museum. So also our digital games curator is really great about knowing what kind of formats and players that we need to access these things. And so we have gotten a couple of data tape drives in, and it's just a matter of plugging away at them. We're successful at getting about a dozen tapes from one of our collections imaged with digital files on them. So we know that it's possible. And that's another great idea for a future project for us, because especially within the company records of Atari, we have a ton of digital data tapes. But yeah, that's a great point. Also on my to-do list.
And it looks like we have one final question. Is Preservica preferred to Lyrasis or Omeka, and why?
So Preservica is kind of a full service digital asset management system. Omeka is maybe more of like a collections database. It's very good for maybe doing online exhibits or that sort of thing, but I wouldn't recommend Omeka to like be the end all storage solution for your project. I know that Lyrasis does archive space, and they host a couple of other products, obviously. But after doing our research with that digital power grid, which we definitely recommend checking out, and that'll be part of our resources list, and you can also access it from the links list of our presentation. Preservica really just checked all the boxes for us.
And I popped in, somebody was asking about the Moon is Harsh Mistress, and our digital games curator, he does a series and on Twitch, and then they save it to YouTube, is called Game Saves. So these are games that, like the Moon is a Harsh Mistress, never made it to production, and that we, somehow have recreated it. So yes, we have a Twitch stream.
Yes.
And it's Andrew, and we're trying to get our cataloger here in the library is a gamer. Julia and I both consider ourselves like the
we like Tetris.
We like yeah, I had like a TRS 80 and played like one game, and that was it. But yeah, so take a look. It should be linked from all of their you'll be able to find it from that link to that blog post. So yeah, he does great stuff.
Check it out.
That I can't do.
I see Elizabeth also posted is recording of the previous June webinar available. It is available via the DIPSNY website, and then it pops out, I think, to YouTube. So if you go to the DIPSNY page and check out previous webinars, it's on there.
And I can also link that in the same email that I sent to everyone with the recording from this webinar. So it can all be in one spot for you all.
If you just want to listen to my melodious voice for 2 hours.
you won't get to hear mine, but that's okay.
All right, let's give it just a little bit more time to see if anyone has any other questions before we close out. Sometimes it takes a bit to type in, so
yeah, obviously otherwise just our emails are up there, and Leah can make sure to share those with the group too. We're happy to answer any questions or point you in a direction of somebody that does have answers. And we're also both on Twitter, and we share stuff from the collections all the time. And it's Women in Games Week here at the museum, so we're sharing all sorts of great things from the archives, whether it's somebody that created a game or was really instrumental in game development, both analog and digital. So we have all kinds of fun stuff out there right now.
Yeah.
Great. Well, not seeing any more questions, I would like to thank everyone for joining us today, and thank you, Julia and Beth, for such an interesting and engaging presentation. If you folks enjoyed today's presentation and would like to join us for another webinar, next week, actually on Tuesday, is our next presentation. It is about how to choose a collections management system. So again, that's going to be next Tuesday, and that's at 1 p.m. And you can find all of the information for that and all of our other educational programs at dhpsny.org/education. So thanks again, and I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.